Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to Design at Large. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lawrence van der Maaten. Is that close?
Very good, yeah.
Very good. Lawrence comes highly recommended by our good friend Jeff Hinton. So that's sufficient introduction. I should just stop here. But he got his PhD at Tilburg in the Netherlands.
That's right.
Computer vision. Is coming back to UCSD to postdoc here with Lawrence Saul. He left there, I think, to become an assistant professor at Delft and has been recruited away to Facebook AI Research Group in New York City. And reason I really wanted to hear, I really liked some of the work that he actually started with Jeff. You know, as people, we're fundamentally perceptual creatures. And a lot of representation and things is to make abstract and visible things perceptually knowable. And the work that Lawrence is going to talk about really focuses on taking higher dimensional spaces and embedding them in the kind of spaces that we can make sense out of, 2D and 3D kinds of spaces. And I think that's really special and important. And he has just some really great findings too. So, Lawrence.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back. I did a postdoc here in 2010 with Lawrence Saul. Right, my office was right over there, and it's really nice to enjoy the San Diego weather again. It's a lot better than New York. I should move back here at some point. So I'm working now at Facebook AI Research, which is a research lab that sort of the final aim of which is to build artificial intelligence. But since we don't really know how to do that yet, in the meantime, we're trying to solve problems in computer vision, in natural language understanding, in speech recognition, all those fields. And one of the sort of ingredients that we think is important in the solution to those problems are embeddings of symbols, of concepts, of graphs, etc. And so that's where sort of the relation between my current work and the work that I'll be presenting sort of is. What I'll be talking about in this talk, as Jim already said, is about using the idea of embeddings, of building low-dimensional representations for complex, high-dimensional data for visualization. So I saw in the seminar series there are a lot of great visualization speakers, and I feel very humbled to be sort of one of them in particular because I'm not really a visualization person. I look at these kinds of plots and I think, well, that is beautiful. If only I knew how to make this kind of cool stuff. But at the same time, as a machine learner, I also look at this and I see sort of one main shortcoming here, and that is you can use all these kinds of plots to visualize your data, but you're always limited to visualizing a few variables, a few parameters at a time, right? Maybe, the best you can do is maybe like a parallel coordinates plot where you can, maybe do 8 to 10 variables and look at it at the same time and still make some sense out of it. But in machine learning, we routinely work with, hundreds or thousands or 10,000s of variables. And there's just, no good way to use these techniques to do the visualization of that sort of data. And so the question I'm basically answering in this, or asking in this work is, well, how can we visualize high-dimensional data? And so the idea that I've been working on, and also a lot of other people, Lawrence Saul being one of them, one of the pioneers in this area actually, is to learn embedding. So what do I mean by that? So let's say we are given a set of n high-dimensional objects. So let's call them x1 to xn. So you're right, it's actually not working. Let's call them x1 to xn. Now, how can we get a feel for how these objects are arranged in this sort of large high-dimensional space? And the idea is to basically try and build a map, a two-dimensional or three-dimensional map of the data, in which the distances between the points in the map reflect the similarities in the high-dimensional data, right? So the idea would be to build a two-dimensional map where you basically have a point for each original observation, and what you want is you want the pairwise distances between these points to somehow represent the underlying similarities in the original data. So this would probably be a very bad map, right? Like the right map that you want in this case would be this, of course. Now in practice, this will never be really possible, right? Because we cannot possibly, unless our data lies on like a two-dimensional plane in the high-dimensional data, we cannot possibly preserve all the pairwise distances. And so we have to make some compromises in which distances we are going to preserve and which we're going to sort of ignore. And all the techniques that basically exist in this field are about making basically that choice, right? About like which pairwise distances in the original data do I care about and which ones are not so important in my visualization. So what do we need in order to construct a map like this? Well, we need some sort of objective function that basically measures the discrepancy between, on the one hand, the similarities in the original data, and on the other hand, the distances or the similarities in the map, right? And so what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and develop objective functions that measure this discrepancy. Now, one technique I'm sure most of you are familiar with that does this is principal component analysis, right? Just to sort of refresh, in case you've forgotten, what principal component analysis does is it takes your high-dimensional data and it searches for a two-dimensional or like a low-dimensional subspace in such a way that if you project your data onto the subspace, the variance of the data is maximized. And I'm showing you an example of a visualization that you could make with principal component analysis here. So the underlying data here are these images of handwritten digits. And so in the map here, each of these points corresponds to one digit. What I did here was I represented the digit just as a vector of pixels. So I think each digit here has 784 pixels, right? So each of these digits is a point in some 784 dimensional space. And I projected it down to 2D. And to make it a bit clearer, I colored the points, right, which correspond to the digits, according to which digit they represent, right? So these red guys over here, those are all the zeros in this data set. And the orange guys over here, those are all the ones. And so this is the first principal component, and what you can see is that the main source of variation is actually the difference between zeros and ones, which makes sense if you think about digits in terms of pixel values, right? Like a 0 and a 1, they have very few overlapping pixels. The second principal component here, it basically goes from 4 7s and 9s here to 3 5s and 8s here. So both those groups, they're sort of similar in terms of the number of overlapping pixels. So this is a visualization you can make, and you see some structure. But really the reason you see the structure is because I gave you the colors, right? If you didn't know the labels of these digits, you would have seen something like this, and it would be very hard to tell what is going on, right? Like maybe you could tell, well, there seems to be slightly higher density here. Maybe that means something, but that's about all, right? And so, well, why doesn't this work so well, right? Like, why doesn't this map sort of correspond with our own intuition of digits, which is that there's sort of 10 different ones, and that there's some sort of, that maybe 4 7s and 9s are a bit more similar, but that's about it. So why is that not here? Well, there are basically two reasons. One, because we do a linear projection, so that's very limited in terms of what we can actually learn. And the other one is that PCA makes a choice in terms of which distances to preserve, which is it says, I want to make sure that things that are dissimilar in the original data are dissimilar in my two-dimensional data, right? Things that are far apart need to remain far apart. That's sort of, this maximizing variance idea. And now the question you can ask is, well, if my data is somehow a bit more complex, are large distances, are those actually informative, right? And for a while, these kinds of data sets were very popular in machine learning because they sort of convey the notion that, well, maybe distances between those 2 points are not actually that informative, right? Maybe you can only look at data sort of locally on a manifold, and those are the only distances that you should be trusting. And in terms of visualization, it's sort of the same, right? Like, do you really care how different zeros are from ones, or do you just want to see that they're different, right? Probably you're happy as long as you can see that zeros are not the same as ones, but you don't have very strong intuition for exactly how different they should be. So in contrast to PCA, what we're going to try and do is not focus on trying to preserve distances like this, but we're only going to try and preserve sort of small distances, right? So basically we're only going to try and make sure that if I put a point in a map, that the nearest neighbors of that point in the original data are also near neighbors in the two-dimensional map. And what we will see is that that leads to very different kinds of visualizations. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me, by the way. Okay, so how do we formalize that idea? So here's the basic idea. So this is a technique called stochastic neighbor embedding. So what the idea is, we are in our high-dimensional space and we have a bunch of objects. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our high-dimensional object, which I call here xi, and we're going to center a little Gaussian on it, right? We're going to put a little Gaussian bell on it, and we're going to measure the density of all the other points, x sub j, under that Gaussian, right? And so what we'll get is for points that are similar to xi, we will get some quantity between 0 and 1. And for points that are somewhere over here, we will basically get an infinitesimal value, right? So we get a characterization of the local structure of the data. And then the next thing that we do is, so we compute all these densities, and then we divide by the sum of all these densities. And this gives us a kind of probability. It gives us a distribution over pairs of points, ij, where the probability of picking a pair of points is somehow proportional to how similar these points are, right? So there's a good chance that if I draw from this distribution, there's a good chance that I will pick two similar points, but the chance of picking two dissimilar points is virtually 0, right? So now we have these things, and now we're going to go to our low-dimensional space, to our two-dimensional map, the map that we want to create. So here we're going to basically represent each point in high-dimensional data by a point in this two-dimensional map, which I will call yi and yj. So we have this point yi, it sits somewhere in our two-dimensional map, and we're basically going to do the same thing again. We're going to center a Gaussian over it, and we're going to measure the density of all the other points y sub j under that Gaussian, right? And we're going to do the same normalization here. So we're going to divide by the sum over all pairs, and this gives us another distribution. I will call this distribution Q, and this is this Qij here basically represents the probability of me picking a pair of points, right? But now this probability is proportional to how similar these 2 points are, how close together these points are in the map, right? So now what do I want? Well, ideally, I want to lay out the points in this two-dimensional map in such a way that these probabilities Qij are as similar as possible to the probabilities Pij that I computed in the original space, right? So what we're going to be measuring is some sort of distance between this distribution Q here and the distribution P that I computed on the original data. And the way we're going to measure that discrepancy between these two distributions is by means of the Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is sort of the natural measure for measuring how different distributions are. And it takes this form. It's a sum over all pairs of points of Pij log Pij over Qij, right? And so this thing has a couple of properties. I'll go into a bit more detail later. But one property is the Kullback-Leibler divergence between two distributions that are the same is 0, and it's only 0 if the two distributions are the same, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to move the points around here. So we're going to play with the yi's and yj's in such a way as to try and minimize this function here, this Kullback-Leibler divergence. And the way we implement that is with basically a gradient descent algorithm, right? So we're going to do gradient descent in this function with respect to the locations of all the points, right? And intuitively, you can think about that as sort of moving the points around until they reach a configuration where the Qij probabilities are pretty much the same as the Pij probabilities that are computed in the input space. Does this make some sense? All right, I see some nods, so that's good. So what is this, why do we use this Kullback-Leibler divergence, right? Like, there's some nice mathematical reasons maybe, but what does it really do? Well, you can think of it as follows. So let's say I have two similar objects, right? So two similar objects in the original data, they had a large value Pij, right? So if I have two similar objects, I get a large Pij here, I get a large Pij here, well, then I better make sure that this guy is not 0, right? Because otherwise I get a large value, divide by 0, I multiply by another large value, so that's going to be large, right? So I'm going to pay a very large penalty for having two things that are similar in the original data far apart in the map. It doesn't work the other way around, right? Like if I have two points that are very dissimilar, I don't really pay a penalty for putting them closer together, because this Pij outside here is basically infinitesimal, right? So if I have a large, if I have similar points modeled by distant points in the map, I'll pay a large price. And so really what this technique is doing is it's mainly trying to preserve sort of the local similarity of the data, right? It's only trying to make sure that, things that were close to you are still close to you in the map. Now, if you run this algorithm and you run it on the same data, you get a very different visualization. You get something that looks like this. And, it's still maybe not perfect, but at least it got some of the groups right? It figured out like that zeros are sort of a cluster of things, and that there are basically no other digits that are, very similar to zeros. And so you see it gets some of these groups correctly. And you should keep in mind it doesn't know about the groups, right? It only sees the digit images, but it doesn't know that these are digits. So it basically doesn't have the colors. So, it gets something right, but at the same time you see that some of the clusters here, they're sort of overlapping, right? It seems like you had the right map, but there was sort of a guy who sort of, pushed everything a little bit together, and that's why things got sort of mixed up here in the middle. And this is something that we called the crowding problem. And I'll try to explain what happens here as follows. So suppose I have data that is intrinsically high dimensional. And suppose I also, so what I mean by that is basically it doesn't lie on a two-dimensional plane, right? It's really sort of filling up the high dimensional space somehow. And suppose also that we try to model the local structure of the data in this two-dimensional map, right? Which, as I just explained to you, is what stochastic neighbor embedding is doing. Then the result of that is that dissimilar points have to be modeled too far apart in the map. And this is not so easy to see, so I'll demonstrate it by a very simple example. Let's say we have our high-dimensional space is now 2D, because that's the biggest I can visualize. And let's say we call these two things, we call those small distances, and we call this distance a large distance, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to try and embed this data into one dimension, because we cannot go lower than 1. And we're going to try and do it in such a way that the small distances here are preserved, right? So we want to keep the rods the same size. Well, we can do that perfectly, right? It's great embedding. But look what happens. This large distance here, that actually became larger, right? It just went from square root 2 to 2, right? And so this is basically also happening when you make these kinds of embeddings, right? You have all these pairs of points that are dissimilar, and if you think about all pairs of points, and actually most of them will be dissimilar, right? And so they all want to be a bit closer together, right? So they're all sitting in that map there, and they all want to be a bit closer together, and they're sort of crushing the map, right? And that's what is causing this crowding in the middle. Does this make sense? All right. So,
Wait, can I ask a question
yeah.
about that? So that 1D embedding where the long length went from root 2 to 2, so far that doesn't seem to be a problem.
So far, no. But if you think about the cost function that we're trying to minimize, so the stochastic neighbor embedding will not learn this embedding, because when it has this embedding, basically these two guys, they want to be a bit closer together, right? And so the embedding that it will actually learn will be basically move this point here and move this point here, right? So you pay a little bit of a price in terms of preserving these small distances, but like this pair of points actually got a bit happier, right? And now if you have, here we have only 3 points, so everything is fine, right? But if you have a couple of thousand points, then there are lots of these points that try and be a bit closer together, and so they will sort of start crushing the map. Yeah? So here's the solution that we came up with to try and sort of address this problem. So this is a technique called t-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, or t-SNE. And the idea here is to, in the map, use a different distribution to measure similarities. So what we're going to do is we're going to redefine these Qij probabilities to not be measured by a Gaussian distribution, but in this case by a t-distribution with 1 degree of freedom. And as you may remember, a t-distribution is a heavy-tailed distribution, right? So what that means is that if I have 2 points that are dissimilar, that are far apart in the original data, so let's say they had a distance of 20, right? And that gave me under the Gaussian a density of 0.01. Then to get the same density of 0.01 under this student t-distribution in the 2-dimensional map, I probably need to put them 40 or 50 apart, right? So by redefining these similarities using a heavy-tailed distribution, effectively what I'm saying is it's okay for dissimilar points to be modeled too far apart in the map, right? And what we'll see is that this sort of eliminates this crowding problem. So if we do this change in the algorithm and we run the same gradient descent procedure, then we get something like this. So here you see the actual gradient descent working. It starts from a random map. And so this is the same data, right? And keep in mind it doesn't know about the actual labels. And what you can see is that it actually does a pretty good job of figuring out that, that zeros are really very different things from all the other digits, right? There's some clear separation between zeros and all the other things. At the same time, you can, in this map already very nicely see that sort of large distances are sort of meaningless, right? It puts zeros and ones, sort of next to each other. But basically, like this distance is about as meaningful as this distance in a map like this, right? But you see sort of the effect here, like if here I would have removed the colors, you could actually have made some sense out of this data, right? You would have been able to identify some of the clusters here. And now if we go and we plot back the original digit images in the locations that they got in the map, we also see that a lot of the local structure in this data is preserved. So for instance, if we zoom in on this cluster of zeros, we see that zeros are things that are round or sort of more elongated, right? And in here we see that they can have slightly different orientations, right? And so this is kind of the local structure, and that's the thing that is really trying to preserve. The same thing if you zoom in here, right? So you see that 4s, 7s, and 9s are still sort of put together, and the reason is that they're sort of connected by digits like this one. Is that a 4 or a 9? I'm not sure, and as a result it sort of ended up in between, right? Here also you see these sort of orientations, and you see here like a group of 7s as people in Europe would write them, with a little horizontal crossbar. And those are sort of separated out. So to give you an idea of sort of how I used this in the beginning was basically as a way to assess the computer vision systems I was building. So one of the problems I was interested in was in building representations for texture images that were invariant under basically different viewpoints. And before, always what I would do is I would design those features, I would throw them into a machine learning system, and I would measure some sort of classification error. And that gave me some idea of how good my features were. But now what I could do is I could actually throw those features into t-SNE and visualize them, and I would see clusters like this, right? Which really sort of told me that the representations I had built, the features I had built for texture images, were actually invariant under viewpoints, right? Which is the thing I really wanted to see. In terms of visualizations, you can use this for lots of different things, right? So one example is trying to visualize movies based on user ratings. So if you're a company like Netflix, you basically have, for a lot of movies and a lot of users, you have ratings of users that users gave to those movies. And a couple of years ago, Netflix actually had a large competition where they sort of challenged people to try and predict what ratings users would give to a movie. And if you were the best at that, you could win $1 million. So, that's how I got interested as well. I didn't win the $1 million, but it was still fun. So the basic way in which techniques for doing that sort of prediction work is they make a big matrix where you have in the columns all the movies and in the rows all the users, and you put in the ratings when you have them, right? So this is a sparse matrix. And now what you're going to learn is you're going to do a matrix factorization of this big matrix. So you're going to represent this matrix as a product of basically two skinny matrices, one where the columns correspond to the movies and one where the rows correspond to the users. And you're going to basically learn these two matrices in such a way that if you compute this product, that the sort of observed values are as similar as possible to the values you've observed here. And now for the non-sparse parts of this product, that basically gives you your prediction, right? You can use this product also to predict the ratings that you have not observed. But you can also do other stuff, right? You can also basically go and say, well, hey, here I have a column per movie, and those columns apparently somehow describe these movies, in the sense that if I have two similar movies, where similar now means basically the same users would give them the same ratings, then they must have similar columns in this movie matrix, right? So what I can do is I can take these movie columns as sort of my high-dimensional features for movies, and I can throw them into t-SNE and try and do a visualization. If you do that, you get something like this. So here what we did is we did a three-dimensional embedding, and we represent the first two dimensions of this embedding by the x and y axis, and the third one by the color of the plot of the name, right? So what this basically means is in this map, two movies are similar when they're close together and they have the same color, right? Now, if you zoom in on this map, you will see things like this, right? So, for instance, there's a cluster on top, which is, The Simpsons, Family Guy, and South Park. Kind of makes sense, right? If you go down here, you see all the Bond movies and Mission Impossible. Apparently, those attract the same kinds of viewers. Other things that immediately are visible are like these colored clusters right here, right? Well, if you look at that orange cluster there, it's Indiana Jones, Final Fantasy, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Star Wars, right? So this is like, nerd territory, basically. The red ones over here are Friends season 1 to 20. I don't know how many seasons there were, but all of them were there. And the orange guys are all the Star Trek ones, which are not entirely with the Star Wars movies, which also makes sense. So these are the kinds of visualizations you can try and do. Yeah.
So the local clusters make sense, but what about the distance between Star Trek and Star Wars?
So you definitely see. So you definitely see, if you would print out the map really large, you would definitely see sort of genres of movies, right? So you'd see sort of a large group of all horror movies or all romantic comedies. And the reason is that, that there are always sort of movies that are connecting these things, right? So you definitely do see that structure. The only time you don't, like, the structure becomes meaningless when you basically have two clusters that are really just disjoint, right? Like zeros and ones, right? Like those are, completely disjoint from everything else, and then the location of that cluster is meaningless. But in these kinds of sort of more real world data, typically you don't have clusters that are that clear. If you have clusters that are that clear, you should probably be worried. Like you probably have a weird bias in your data, or your measurement machine didn't work well on a particular day, or things like that. Yeah, good question. So in terms of more serious research, one of the things we did together with people at the Allen Brain Institute is use this for visualizing genomics data. So the data here are basically, you take a mouse brain and you cut it up into very thin slices. And now at a bunch of locations in these slices, you measure the full gene expression profile, right? So at every voxel in the mouse brain, you get a 20,000 dimensional gene expression vector. Yeah?
So KL is not symmetric. So what if you make it symmetric to measure Q against P as well? Will you see any?
So then you get exactly what you don't want, in the sense that then you get an objective that sort of behaves like PCA. And there are people who argue that this is the right way of doing it, because this is sort of what you would measure when you would think of it as a latent variable model, right? But it doesn't give nice maps. Yeah, good question. So what we see when we sort of visualize these gene expression data is that gene expressions in this case, they really sort of cluster by anatomic regions in the mouse brain. Now, I'm no expert on the anatomy of a mouse brain, but these are apparently sort of the main regions, and you can fairly clearly see them show up, right? Which is interesting for brain researchers to see. And here, what we did was also a different type of visualization, where what we do is we take the gene expression, we use t-SNE to create a 3D map. And then what we do is we use the 3D locations to basically create a color, right? So the first dimension in the 3D map is going to be like the amount of red, the second one is going to be the amount of green, and the third one is going to be the amount of blue, right? And so then we can make maps like this, where basically what these mean are, well, if two voxels have a similar color, that means that they had a similar gene expression profile, right? And so that generates pictures like this, which are nice to look at, but they can also be, they can also show interesting things. Like one of the first things we saw was actually, in one of the first runs that we did, we actually saw something like this. And so what is this? Well, these are the slices that people make, right? So it turned out that all the variance in this data was actually, due to differences between slices, which, are sort of artifacts of the data, right? And so, like, the first thing we realized essentially was that the data was not properly normalized, and which is a bit worrying because there were already quite a few publications that used this data in, all sorts of statistical analysis, but never actually, looked at these things and sort of got their normalization right? So the first thing we did was actually, sort of use these visualizations to guide us towards normalizations of the data that would actually sort of, get rid of these artifacts. Now, one thing I didn't talk about yet is, well, how do you make this scale, right? Like, I'm a computer scientist, so I immediately started asking questions about, like, complexity of algorithms, right? And the way I explain the algorithm right now, I have an algorithm that's order n squared, right? If I have n points, I need to look at all n squared pairwise similarities in order to produce a map. And so I can do that as long as I have 5,000 digits. But pretty quickly, bioinformatics people started showing up at my door, and they had 1 million measurements of whatever. and they wanted me to do a plot, and I couldn't, right? It just wouldn't scale. So what is interesting, if you want to try and solve that problem, is to have a look at the gradient of the t-SNE cost function. So the gradient actually takes this form, right? So what this is saying is, well, how should I move point yi in order to make this Kullback-Leibler divergence a little bit smaller? And if you look at it, it consists of two parts. So there's a spring between point yi and yj, and then there is some sort of exertion or compression of that spring. In particular, you see this term here, pij minus qij, right? So if I model the data perfectly in the map, then this term is 0, right? And the spring will be completely happy, right? It will not exert any force on the points. But if they're dissimilar, then it will either attract the points or repel them, right? And then there's this sum, which is the sum over all pairs of points, right? So essentially what I have is I have a bunch of stars here, and I'm moving around, like let's say I want to move this star a little bit. All the other stars exert some sort of gravitational force onto this star, and I need to compute the resultant force, right? So now what you can do is you can go to the Journal of Astronomy in the 70s and look at how they solve these things. And if you're familiar with like force-directed graph layouts, there you can use similar tricks to basically get those to scale well. So the approximation we use there is called a Barnes-Hutt approximation. And the idea is basically that if you have 3 points over here that are relatively close together, and they're relatively far away from the points that they're exerting a force on, then maybe I can get away with saying, well, I just compute one force, right? I just compute the center of mass of these 3 points here. I compute the force that the center of mass would exert on this point I, and I multiply it by 3, right? This is the basic idea, and what it leads to is to an n log n algorithm that's a lot more efficient and that you can actually use to scale up to like millions of examples. So these are some details on how you implement that. I'll skip over those for now. Ask me if you're interested offline. And so now we can scale to much bigger data sets. So these are, for instance, like the full digit data set. This was for a long time like the main benchmark in machine learning. It's finally abandoned, luckily. And here you can see similar things, right? Like orientations and all that stuff. Here we also use it for basically trying to assess how our computer vision systems are doing, right? So this is a visualization of features that are learned by a convolutional network on a bunch of images. And then you see that they actually group by cars or planes or things like that. So we really use it sort of as an inspection tool to inspect other algorithms or systems. Or it's just a fun way, in this case, to visualize Instagram photos. So this is sort of the Instagram universe, and you can sort of start going over it to see what people actually post on Instagram. Well, they post a lot of pictures of cats. It's unsurprising. They post pictures of dogs. They post pictures of, in this case, a lot of food. Not really surprising. Flowers. So basically everything is sort of in there, right? So this is sort of all your Instagram photos in a single plot. One other interesting visualization I want to show is this one. So this is a visualization of words, and the words are visualized based on something called word-to-vec embeddings. So the idea here is that so word-to-vec model, basically, it represents each word by some vector in, let's say, 300 dimensions. And what it wants to do is basically wants to make sure that words, that vectors of words that are co-occurring in a sentence, that those vectors are close together. And you basically download the internet, you train an algorithm to learn to learn those vectors, and now you visualize the word vectors. And so what you then see is you can see clusters like this, right? So you can see that by just sort of reading all of Wikipedia or reading all of the internet, you can actually figure out that these words are all semantically related, right? Here's all your favorite TV networks. Here are words related to holidays or vacation. Here are words that are related to voting. The only thing it hasn't figured out is the difference between Democrats and Republicans. It's still puts them in one big pot. Here are like all sorts of words that have to do with transportation, things like that. And basically wherever you look in this map, you see this kind of structure. The reason I'm showing this map is because it also highlights one of the sort of limitations of the technique I discussed so far. And in particular, what I mean by that is the limitation of using a single map. So let's say I really want to visualize words like this in a map, right? Or maybe it's not words, but maybe it's authors of papers based on their co-authorship. Or for a while it was very popular to analyze the Enron email corpus to see what was going on there, who was emailing who, and so on. Or more general scale-free networks, etc. Then you run into the following problem. How can we model the words river, bank, and bailout appropriately in one map? There's basically no way of properly doing it, right? If I put river close to bank, which makes sense, and I put bank close to bailout, which makes sense, then river and bailout have to be close together, right? Like we're basically, we're limited by the triangle inequality, and that doesn't make any sense, right? River and bailout have nothing in common other than that they both have something in common with the word bank. So how can we get around that? So one solution that we worked on is something that we call multiple maps t-SNE. And the idea is as follows. Instead of learning one map, we're going to learn two maps. We're going to learn them simultaneously. And what we're going to do is we're going to give each word a point in each of the maps, but we're also going to assign a weight to each word in each of the maps. And now we're going to optimize both the locations of the words and these weights. And now all of a sudden I can represent these similarities appropriately. Because what I can do is I can put river and bank close together in map 1 and give them both high weights. The word bailout is also in this map, but it has a 0 weight, so I'm not showing it, right? And in the second map, I'm going to do the other thing. I'm going to put bailout and bank close together with high weights. The word river is also in here, but it has weight 0. I've learned that. So I'm not showing that word river. And now all of a sudden I have a much better representation of the underlying similarities, right? So in this way, I can actually visualize non-metric similarities, essentially.
Why is bank one word?
So in this case, you could also try and say, well, we try and explicitly split out the senses. I'll show you in 2 slides why that will not take you all the way. Like you'll basically always fall short. But there are also data sets, like if you think about scale-free networks or anything like that, or like co-authors on papers, like they're actually the same person, but they publish with people at UCSD and they publish with people at Harvard. So they sort of want to be in the middle between both, and then you get UCSD people next to Harvard people, which may or may not make sense, right? So see it as an illustration, I guess. So how do we formalize this? Well, we basically set it up like this. Again, we're going to redefine these QIJ probabilities, these similarities under a model, and we're going to make them a bit more complicated. So this yi super m is basically the location of word I in map M, right? And this pi super m here is the weight of word I in map M. So what you have here is the similarity of words I and j in map M. And this is the same thing as I had before in the t-SNE objective, right? It's just this student t kernel that I put over this point yi, and I measure the density of all the points yj under that student t kernel. But now I'm going to multiply it by the weights of those words in that map, right? So if one of the two words has 0 weight in this map M, then I'm basically going to set this whole guy to 0, right? I'm going to say, well, in this map, at least these two words are not similar. And now I'm going to sum that over all maps, right? So my final measure of whether two words are similar is basically, well, you know, summed over all the maps, how similar are these words in each of the maps, right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to do the same thing. I'm going to again minimize this Kullback-Leibler divergence using gradient descent, but it's a little bit different because now I'm moving all the points in all of the maps around simultaneously, and I'm also changing these weights, right? I'm learning all those things jointly. And if you do that, so here's an example where we did this on a word association data set. So this is a data set, I think, from the University of Southern Florida, which is used a lot, I think, in linguistics research and so on, where basically what they did is, I can play it with you, Jim. I will say a word, and you have to say the first thing that comes to mind. I say coffee. Tea. And so you do this experiment a ton of times, and now what you get at the end is basically a probability. What is the probability that, given that I give as input, as stimulus, coffee, what is the probability that the response is tea, right? And this probability is a very natural input into these t-SNE algorithms, right? That is basically going to be our Pij now, right? Pij is the probability of coffee given tea, right? And so they gathered a ton of this association data for like 5,000 different words. And we did visualizations of that data. So here I'm showing you two of the maps that we learned. There were in total like 20 maps, but I'm showing you two here. And so I'm only showing the words that have high weights, right? Like words with 0 weight are not shown here, right? But keep in mind that all the words are actually in all the maps. Now you can see some interesting stuff, right? Like here's, for instance, a cluster with all sorts of words related to sports, right? Like arena and stadium and soccer and coach. And there's also the word cheerleader. Well, that makes sense, right? Cheerleader to be close to sports. But then if we look in this other map, here the word cheerleader is also present, but here it's next to gorgeous and sexy and beauty, which is a completely different type of association that people have with the word cheerleader. And by setting up the learning algorithm in this way, it was actually able to sort of unravel these two types of associations. And I guess that answers your question. You know, it's really the same word, but it's a different type of association that people have. As a second example, so for instance, here you see a bunch of words that are related to, you know, sort of to states or like how states are governed, right? Like monarchy and oligarchy and anarchy, okay, they're maybe not governed, democracy, republic, and so on, right? If you look at this word monarchy, it also shows up here. But now it shows up with all sorts of words that are sort of related to the pageantry surrounding monarchy, right? So England and royal and monarch and queen and king, right? Which is a different type of association that people have with the word monarchy. Yes?
So how do you decide number of maps?
It's, you know, it's kind of like in clustering algorithms. It's a little bit like this. You can do, I mean, one of the things that you can do is basically you can learn a model with different numbers of maps, and you can basically plot the objective function value as a function of the number of maps, right? And what you'll see is that in the beginning it goes down a lot, right? Because there's, you know, a lot of structure that was wrong in like one map that the second map was able to fix, right? And maybe the third map also still helps. But at some point, you know, it starts asymptoting out, right? It starts decaying, and typically that's, you know, that's where you want to. I mean, that's one way in which you can sort of pick the number of maps that you want to use. Any other questions? Okay. So one last thing I wanted to show, maybe because this is actually stuff that people at UCSD here have also worked on, in particular Gerd Kriet and Serge Belongi, which is basically the problem of, well, if you wanna visualize things like human similarity ratings, then you always have this problem that human similarity ratings are very very unreliable, right? If I ask you on a Likert scale, how similar is A to B, let's say how similar is a Fiat to a Ferrari, then some of you will say 5 because both are Italian cars, but some of you will say 1 because Ferrari is awesome and a Fiat's not so much, right? So these things are very unreliable, and also like the other main reason, I guess, is that people have sort of different internal scales of similarity. And so often in cognitive science, people instead ask things like, well, is A more similar to B or more similar to C, right? And so what they gather is they gather a set of similarity triplets, of triplets IJL, which basically means that object I is more similar to object J than to object L. So the question we asked in this work is, well, can we somehow use these kinds of triplets to learn embeddings, right? Like, can we learn a representation for A, B, and C that we can show in a map based on these similarities? And basically, the techniques we came up there are sort of, the idea is similar. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to define a distribution over triplets, IJL, where we measure the similarity between I and J, and we divide that by the sum of the similarity between I and J and I and L, right? And so this thing will this will be large if I and J are very close together, right? If this number is large, but I and L are very far apart, right? That's basically when this probability is large, right? So PIJL is large whenever I actually satisfy a triplet in my embedding. And so the way we're going to learn these embeddings, the way in which we're going to learn the values of these x's here, is by, in this case, just maximizing the sum of these probabilities over our set of triplets. And so this is something that we called stochastic triplet embedding. We tried the same two versions. So here we have like this Gaussian version, but what works a lot better in practice is this sort of version where you have a student t distribution. So I'm just going to show you some examples. So this is like the first experiment we did, which is on this digit data set where we just, from the digits, generated a set of triplets just to see how different techniques would behave. So these are actually both techniques that came out of UCSD that sort of inspired me to start working on this problem. And these are the kinds of maps that they learn. And then the final algorithm we came up with got to this map, which is, it's not nearly as good, of course, as the map that I showed earlier, where you had all pairwise distances between digits. But here you only had access to sort of very partial information, right? You only knew for a few triplets, and one of the problems is the number of triplets is insane, right? It's n to the power, it's n cubed. And you didn't even know like the exact similarities for these n cubed, but only, these guys must be closer together than these guys. But it's still able to figure out some structure, like it's still able to figure out that ones are really different. Sort of the real experiment we did here was a visualization of a data set of music artists where people were actually asked, okay, is this artist more like this artist than like this artist? And so what we see here is that in this case you can actually, visualize some of the structure in that map. I'm not really a music expert, but I presume this classifies as sort of hard rock or something like that. This is sort of more pop, and they're actually all female singers, I think. There's like a hip hop cluster over here and things like that. And so this is a visualization of these kinds of triplets. So to conclude, so I hope that I have sort of convinced you that a good way to visualize complex high-dimensional data, so it could be high-dimensional observations, that's how I started off, but it could also be non-metric similarities, like in the word associations, or it could be triplets, like in this last example. That you can take this kind of data and try and visualize it in a map, and that may lead to insight into your data and into more insight that you maybe get by other means. And so the main algorithm I showed you to do this is this t-SNE algorithm, which is today it's quite widely adopted, in particular in bioinformatics and medical research. It's sort of, I think today it's like the standard way to analyze flow cytometry data and stuff like that. I sometimes look at those papers. I have no idea what they're about, but you know, people tell me it's useful for them. And what I've showed you is that you can sort of develop different variants of these kinds of embedding techniques to suit sort of your specific data type. Now to conclude, a lot of this was joint work. This work got started, as Jim pointed out in the beginning, as joint work with Jeff Hinton. Some of the later work was done with Kilian Weinberger, in particular the stuff on triplet embedding. And the brain analysis work was done with a ton of people, both at Delft and at the Allen Brain Institute. And these are the papers that I talked about in this talk. That's it. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of wish you had more time to talk about triplets. What I wanted to ask is, when you got to the result on MNIST with the triplets, you mentioned it wasn't as good as the one you had previously. But then you also mentioned that you do triplets with humans, because you think that's a more reliable task, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems there should be a trade-off, right? Like if the pairs are noisy, they may not, but there aren't as many. So like asking people to do just compare two digits might have more bits.
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with a signal to noise ratio, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we did that experiment. If you want to hear about it.
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, one of the main problems here is that, you know, there's so many triplets, and if you're going to ask humans, you cannot possibly ask all of them, right? So you have to be very clever in how you select which triplets you ask for, right? You want to pick triplets that are somehow informative, right? So asking is a 1 more like a 6 or like a 7, that's probably not it's probably not going to give you much information about the underlying intuition that people have about digits, right? And so I think a lot of the work in this area, also a lot of the work that has been done here at UCSD is really focused on, you know, trying to be clever and also sort of do this in an active way, right? So take a set of triplets, learn an embedding like this, and then sort of try and figure out what is still missing, right? Like what information do we not have yet, and sort of use that as sort of a guide, as sort of a way to pick which triplets to ask for next. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. Yes?
So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, but I remember, I guess in the 80s or 90s, there was these kind of papers that looked at using neural networks to do autoencoders and, you know, Hoyos rule and Conan maps and all this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That we use like linear mapping, and it's the same thing as PCA or something like that. So is there any work that explores kind of these neural architectures to do the equivalent of t-SNE or...
Yeah, so I've actually done a study where I take like a deep neural network and I basically train it to minimize the t-SNE objective, right? Like, you know, a neural network is a very flexible thing. On the top, you can define any loss function you want. And so it could also be the t-SNE objective function. And that actually works very well.
Are you still doing the kernelized?
Yeah. So what I do is I basically do a forward pass on a batch of examples, and then, you know, I have the similarities in the original data for that batch. I get output representations right on top of the network. Now I can compute these similarities Qij. I can compute, you know, the gradients that is induced in each of these outputs, and then that gradient I can backpropagate through the network, and it actually works very well. Yeah.
Does it matter how many layers you have, or?
I mean, it needs to be flexible enough, right? Like it will be a bit worse than sort of the non-parametric thing that I'm doing here, just because your model is a bit constrained, right? Like you're a bit more constrained in terms of the functions that you can learn from the original data to the two-dimensional map. But, you know, as long as your model has capacity enough, it can work reasonably well. At the same time, it was never clear to me what the application of this was, because, you know, I would never suggest using it as part of a classification system. because in the end you're still reducing data, so you lose some information that maybe is important in the prediction that you want to make. So really the only value I see for techniques like this is in visualization. But there are people who disagree with me on this.
So
Yes.
in the same context, so regarding your parametric t-SNE and say other deep embeddings for clustering the recent pair work, which was submitted in ICLR, I guess.
Mhm.
How do you see the information from triplets could be incorporated into the whole framework so that all the possible information could be used?
I mean, sort of in general, you can sort of do learning in a multitask way, right? Where you have a bunch of different loss functions that each of them focus on sort of a different source of information. So one could be triplets, one could be some supervised objective, one could be maybe a t-SNE objective or whatever. And you sort of try to get your network to minimize a weighted sum of those things.
I mean, do you see
That-
any value of doing that?
So there are some studies, at least in sort of the supervised learning context, that suggest that this can help. So there's work in natural language processing where people train networks to basically solve 10 different natural language processing tasks at the same time. And there it actually helps. But at the same time, like mixing different loss functions is very difficult because basically because these loss functions can operate on different scales, right? And depending on, like they can have very different shapes. And so depending on sort of how good your model is, you may have to reweight them in different ways. And that makes it really, really tricky, right? So the only successful cases, I think, of multitask learning have been cases where sort of all the losses are in a sense the same, in the sense that they're all classification losses of the same form, or all. So that would be my answer, but I'd be happy to prove them wrong. Yeah.
So assume you compute some macroproblems distance globally. Do you compute it locally to adapt how sensitive it is to compute the macroproblems distance in defining the original distance?
How sensitive it is?
Yeah.
So there are a few tricks that we do there that I didn't talk about yet. So one of the main problems is that one of the main things that you have to do is you have to set the bandwidth of your Gaussian, right? To measure similarity. And what we do there is we basically say, well, we think it's unlikely that the same bandwidth will work well across the entire data space, right? Because maybe, the clusters of ones is probably a much tighter cluster in data space than a cluster of zeros, right? Just because there's sort of more variance. So what we do there is we're basically going to say, instead of computing these joint distributions, we're going to compute conditional distributions. So given point I, what is the probability of point j, right? So we're just going to sort of do row normalization of this Gaussian kernel. And now what we have is basically a different sigma parameter for each of the Gaussians. And we're going to set that sigma parameter by saying we want each of these conditional distributions to have the same perplexity. So they have the same entropy, basically. And this perplexity you can think of intuitively as the number of nearest neighbors, right? So if you want to make a comparison with making a k nearest neighbor graph, the perplexity is essentially a value of k. So it's the number of points that you want to sort of keep close in the final embedding. And the nice thing is that you can find the sort of optimal bandwidth for that particular point. The bandwidth that basically achieves that perplexity, you can find it very efficiently with a binary search. So that's actually what we do in practice. Yeah, good question. Yes? Yeah?
So when you do the multiple t-SNE, if you fix the number of maps and then you train it multiple times, will it usually give you the similar semantic maps, or will there be like infinite number of combination which can give you the same?
I mean, yes and no, right? Like, no in the sense that if you think about this loss function, it's non-identifiable, right? Just like clustering, in the sense that, if I switch map 1 and 3, I have exactly the same solution in terms of the loss function, right? So there are many different solutions that lead to exactly the same same loss value. So in that sense, it will definitely every time reach a different optimum. Sort of qualitatively, I think it's fairly similar each time. Like each time you'll run it, you'll have the cheerleader coming with the sports and with the beauty cluster. But that's, that's more of a qualitative statement. What you can do, and what we do in the papers, of course, is measure things such as, well, if I, for each word in the original data, basically look at what are the 5 most similar words, then what percentage of those 5 most similar words are also the most similar under our model, right? So you can measure those kinds of things to get an intuition for how much of the information is actually preserved in your map or in your maps. And that's very useful to do. But at the same time, the exact way to sort of measure the quality of your maps really depends on your problem.
I can imagine there could be a multiple map version of the t-SNE.
I have not, but you're welcome to try. It will probably work, right? Or it makes sense in the sense that it has the potential to solve my sort of Fiat Ferrari example, right? Like in this stochastic triplet embedding, I mentioned the problem, but I didn't actually solve it, right? So the fact that people have sort of different axes of by which they measure similarity, those axes are in this visualization that I showed, they're sort of mixed, right? They're both in there in some sort of convoluted way. And so you could try and unravel them in multiple maps. So, I think it's a very sensible thing to try. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.